And yet they've actually done so many different scientific studies over the years of people who have won the lottery. And what they find is that there's a very brief peak of happiness for a couple of weeks immediately after winning the lottery. And then people are back exactly to where they were, not even a tiny bit higher than there they were before they won the lottery. And yet, because we are searching, and because we're yearning, and because we've been indoctrinated by our culture to believe that happiness is somehow outside of us, we've become slaves. And we've become slaves to the media that tries to sell us happiness. Advertising is a billion-dollar industry. And yet if you actually look at it, what you'll realize is the really only thing we're selling is happiness. You take, for example, a commercial for soap. Now, what does soap do? Well, soap cleans us. So if we were advertising honestly, we would talk about how this brand of soap cleans us better than that brand of soap. But we don't. No soap commercial ever says, Zest gets you cleaner than Dove. What they do is in the commercial, you see a beautiful woman and she's singing in the shower as she lathers up first thing in the morning, and then her equally beautiful husband dances into the bathroom and they have one of these really loving exchanges, and maybe he hands her a towel or maybe he hands her the bar of Zest. And then they walk out of the bathroom and their child is miraculously already dressed and ready for school, and homework is done and breakfast dishes are put away, and we're not selling soap. We're selling happiness. And it sounds absurd. I mean, when I describe it like this, we laugh and we think, well, of course, I wouldn't believe that just by changing my brand of soap, suddenly my husband would also sing to me in the morning, and my child would somehow get himself dressed and eat his breakfast without me having to do it for him. And yet, it wouldn't be a billion-dollar industry if it didn't work. So on some unconscious, subconscious level, we are so desperate for this elusive thing called happiness that we spend our lives changing our brand of soap, changing our dishwashing liquid, changing our brand of jeans, changing the type of car we drive, searching for that happiness. And then, of course, it doesn't come. And so then we're miserable and we're depressed and we're anxious, and we have to take pills to go to sleep at night, and another pill to convince ourselves that it's worth getting out of bed in the morning. And even after we take the pills to go to sleep and the antidepressants to convince ourselves that it's worth making it through the day, we're still not happy. And so then we turn, I'm going to get a glimpse of that elusive state of happiness. So if it doesn't come from soap, and it doesn't come from winning the lottery, and if it doesn't come from being a billionaire CEO or a center on the Lakers, where does it come from? What is it that determines that state of our happiness that may peak if we win the lottery and then comes down? What determines that? Well, one of the greatest things, one of the most powerful things, and I'm saying this from both the scientific field as well as the spiritual field, is faith. Scientific studies, academic studies where they didn't want this to be true, have shown over and over and over again in dozens and dozens of studies at major universities all over the world that people who have a deep spiritual connection, and it doesn't matter what your religion, it doesn't matter whether you connect to the divine with form, without form, silently, verbally, it doesn't matter. But people who have a deep spiritual connection and devotion are significantly happier than those who don't. There was a study that was conducted several years ago of homeless populations where they compared 3 different populations of homeless people based on their needs and based on their services. So they took a population living in Fresno, California, living on the street, but with access to soup kitchens for food, access to shelters to sleep in, access to free medical care. Then they took a population in Washington State who lived actually in a homeless village that provided not only shelter, not only food, but even things like bicycles and internet access and all sorts of things. And the third population was a group living on the streets of Calcutta who had obviously no bicycles or internet connection, but who also didn't have access to soup kitchens for food, shelters to sleep in, or any medical care. And what they found was miraculous. They found that although the people in Calcutta had by far the least amount of what we call necessities, the least amount of services, the least amount of access to anything, not only were they significantly happier on every scale than the other 2 populations, but they actually rated themselves as richer. Because one of the things that they measured was how poor or how rich do you feel? Now, obviously, if you're homeless, which all 3 populations were, objectively, you're poor. But they gave these people a scale of 1 to 10 of how poor do you feel? And the people in Calcutta actually rated themselves as richer than the people in either of the other populations. What's going on? I think this key of spirituality and of faith is probably the most important aspect there. When we feel abundant, when we feel cared for, we want to share. Abundance and wealth and happiness have nothing to do with what we have. Studies have shown over and over and over and over again. All it has to do with is how we feel about what we have. Not what we have, but how we feel about what we have. People who have a deep spiritual connection feel that their cup is overflowing, which is why they're the people who are always looking to share and to give. It's not because they're trying to get good karma. It's not because they think it's the right thing to do. It's not because they want to be martyrs. It's because they feel so abundant inside. They feel so overflowing that they want to share. We hoard when we feel empty. Doesn't matter what we have. If we feel empty, and of course, as we all know, that emptiness has nothing to do with what's in our bank account or our fridge or our closet. It only has to do with what's in our heart. Because we fill our bank accounts and we fill our closets and we fill our fridges and we fill our stomachs, but we still feel empty. So clearly it doesn't have to do with that. When we feel empty, we hoard. And when we feel full, we share. And the greatest way that I have seen through science and through spirituality to have that experience of abundance, of deep joy, of an overflowing cup, is through spirituality and through faith. Look, if you're eating dinner at home, we take on our plate exactly what we need. We have fed ourselves for 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years based on how old we are. We have a pretty good idea of how much we can eat. We do the same thing 3 times a day. We really are pretty good judges of how much we can eat. And when we eat at home, we put on our plates what we need, knowing that if we want more, all we have to do is take another helping or go back into the kitchen for another serving. Or for Indian, we know that somebody's going to be coming around bringing us chapati after chapati after chapati as long as we can eat. So we don't need to take 10 chapatis at once. We can eat slowly, knowing that the minute I finish this chapati, somebody's going to be standing right over me with a plate with another one. But when we go to a buffet, what do? Inevitably, we pile our plate with more food than we could possibly eat if we had starved ourselves for a week in advance. Because the fear is, oh my God, what if this dessert that's my favorite finishes before I get to come back for seconds? What if I really like this thing that I'm not even sure I know what it is? What if there's no more? Let me take extra now. And then, of course, inevitably, we end up wasting half the plate of food because we couldn't eat it all. But that's really the difference. It's the difference between the faith we have at home, knowing the bowl is full, the kitchen is full, the fridge is full, versus at a buffet thinking it might run out. And that's the key. When we have that connection to the divine, we know it's full. We're being taken care of. We don't have to worry. You look at a child in its mother's arms. No matter what is going on around, if that child is in their mother's arms, they're safe and happy. Because they know mom is there. I remember when I was very young, I was probably 2 or 3, and we were at a gas station in LA, and there was some kind of a shootout. And I don't remember the details. I was too young to process them all. But I remember people hiding behind the gas pumps and screaming. And I have absolutely no recollection of the tiniest bit of anxiety because I was in my mother's arms. And that's true for every child. It doesn't matter if you're on a sinking boat, in a fire, in a shootout. As long as mom's got you in her arms, that child is fine. And if we can only bring that faith into our lives and know that we are being cared for, that we are in the arms, that we're in the arms not just of our mother, but we're in the arms of the Divine Mother. And yet, that faith is hard to have sometimes. We look at the world around us. We look at our own lives. And it seems like there's so much that's wrong, that it's really hard to feel like we're being taken care of. We struggle so much. We have so much pain and confusion and anxiety that it's so hard to have faith. And yet, the issue really is just our vision. It's not that there's so much wrong with the world. It's that as humans, we have a very limited vision. We're subject to all kinds of laws that prevent us from being able to see the full entirety of creation. And so when we look at the world like through a paper towel roll, and we see only this much, of course it looks difficult. There's a wonderful story of 3 men who are taking a walk in the forest, and they decide to rest in the afternoon. And one of the men says to the other 2, you know, this idea of God, I really don't buy it. And the other 2 say, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, the plan just is so clearly faulty that there really can't be a divine God taking care of all this. And the other 2 men say, what do you mean? And he says, well, look over here. We have a pumpkin plant. And these pumpkins are these huge, heavy, big things. And what has God given them? These tiny little flimsy vines to hold them up. And then we have these little mangoes, half a kg of mango. And what has God given? A huge big tree with big thick branches to hold up these mangoes. And he says, clearly, this is backwards. Clearly it's the big, thick, heavy pumpkin that needs a tree and big branches to hold it. And clearly the flimsy little vines would have been fine for the mango. And one of the 2 men says, wow, you're right. Never thought of it like that. The third man says, well, I don't know. I hear what you're saying, but I still have some faith. I still think there must be some kind of a plan. So the 2 non-believers leave the believer in his illusion, and they go off to sit under another tree. And all 3 men lay down to take their afternoon naps. And while they're napping, an afternoon storm comes. And it blows the wind. And one of the mangoes from the tree falls on the face of the non-believer. And he wakes up with a start. And he says, oh my God, I was so wrong. And the other men say, what do you mean? And he says, thank God he put those big, heavy pumpkins right close to the ground. And that up in the air, he put these tiny little mangoes. Because when this little half kg mango fell onto my face, it really hurt. And I can't even imagine what it would have felt like to have one of those pumpkins come down on my head. So it's all about vision. It's all about being able to see either the narrowness of a pumpkin and a mango in their vines, or the vision that says, well, sometimes storms come. And when storms come, they knock fruit off of trees. And so what really should we put up there? One of the greatest keys to that spiritual connection is to have that faith that says, I may not be able to see the full picture, but I realize my ignorance. I realize it's there. And there must be a plan. Another last aspect of this that I want to touch upon is something that was raised last night, which I think is a really important issue. Somebody raised the issue of feeling like we don't deserve happiness. And this concept of self-hatred, of feeling worthless, of not allowing ourselves on some level to fully embrace what the world has to offer. Where does that come from? Well, most of it comes from the voices in our own heads. We have voices in our heads that say to us, you're worthless, you're stupid, you're ugly, you can't do anything right. And we've identified those voices as our self. We've heard them for so long that we think it is self, but it's not self. They're voices of our parents, an aunt, an uncle, a fifth grade teacher, a neighbor. We didn't come into this world with those voices in our head. Somebody put them there. And one of the greatest keys to finding that happiness is to be able to distinguish self from not self. And those voices are not self. We may borrow our younger sister's sweatshirt for years, and we wear it every day, and we love it, and we sleep in it, and we think it's ours. But the day we go off to college, or the day we move out of the house, she's going to remind us, hey, be sure to leave my sweatshirt, because it's hers. And yet, the people who put those voices in our heads are all too happy to let us carry them with us for our entire lives. And so we go through our life thwarting ourselves. We want to start something. No, don't do that. That's not for you. You're not good enough. You're not pretty enough. You're not smart enough. You're not worthy enough. You're not spiritual enough. And these voices are one of the greatest impediments to our path. And the only answer is to identify them for what they are. And the only way to do that is to sit in meditation. And it doesn't matter what form of meditation you practice. All that matters is that you're able to sit quietly and sit stilly for long enough that another voice starts to spring. And that's the divine voice. And that's a voice that says something very different than all the other voices. And it's a voice that's not screechy. It doesn't shout. It doesn't repeat itself over and over again ad nauseum. It's a quiet voice, and it's a gentle voice. And it's a voice that says, you are divine. But we have to sit still long enough to hear it. And when we can hear it, then we can identify the other voices and say, oh, that is my fifth grade teacher. Oh, that was my grandmother. Oh, that was this person. And what we realize then is those are not some omnipotent, omniscient, divine voice that has stamped us as worthless or ugly or stupid for our lives. It's a voice of someone else who was confused, who was scared, who was angry, who was jealous, who had all kinds of their own issues. And distinguishing that is one of the most important things we can do. There's a wonderful true story told about His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He had gone to America and had given time to meet with the top American Buddhist meditation teachers. Those who had been teaching Buddhist meditation for decades, many of whom had been monks themselves. And as the teachers sat with His Holiness, one of them asked him, how can we address this issue of self-hatred in the people who come to us? And evidently it took His Holiness's translator 10